Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I see that it is just turned 4 o'clock. So we're going to start with our third discussion in the series of 5 post-COVID-19 perspectives for architecture in South Africa. It's lovely for me to welcome you here. My name is Harmy Delpoort, and I'm from the future STADIO School of Architecture and Spatial Design. Our first two perspectives addressed how COVID-19 has impacted the way we address urban development and the city, and also how COVID-19 has impacted the way we design urban spaces for live, work, and play. These first two perspectives brought together varied ideas and interactive discussions. I believe today will be no different, and I'm very excited because we went past the 300 registration mark. COVID-19 brought into sharp focus the social, spatial, and environmental inequalities that exist in our society and in our cities, especially in South Africa. As architects and as spatial designers, we need to grab this opportunity to re-emphasize the importance of design thinking as an integrated, essential component of creating responsive and appropriate architecture. Our special skill is to translate issues and ideas into built form through the design process. We are currently faced with the question of how COVID-19 and the aftermath of COVID-19 will shape the future of urban design and architectural thinking and practice. To address this question, the School of Architecture and Spatial Design at STADIO, OpenArchitecture, and the Architectural Education Forum Africa decided to collaborate in a series of 5 online discussions. The School of Architecture and Spatial Design at STADIO is currently under construction. STADIO Holdings is an investment company in private higher education with 6 institutions and over 30,000 students. 4 of these institutions are consolidating into one STADIO Higher Education Institute, which will be launched at the end of October. The School of Architecture and Spatial Design will soon start offering short courses and also our first formal qualifications, a higher certificate, and a Bachelor of Architecture will, if all goes as planned, be launched in 2021. Our courses will be offered in a hybrid, blended way, full-time and part-time. Open Architecture, under the leadership of Professor Lone Paulsen as Program Director, was the first of the South African Institute of Architecture's transformation projects aligned to skills development to address the educational and structural shortcomings of the traditional full-time model of architectural education. The Cape Peninsula University of Technology was the first university to collaborate with Open Architecture, and the successful 6-year pilot was concluded at the end of 2019, when the part-time blended BTech in architectural technology was replaced by the advanced diploma. The program was offered online to students supported through office-based mentorship and occasional block release sessions on campus. The Architectural Education Forum Africa was founded in 2014 to create a platform for architectural educators to share ideas, collaborate through research, and discuss current issues in architectural education. The original Architectural Education Forum was the outcome of a symposium on architectural education hosted by the Wits School of Architecture and Planning in early 2014 under the leadership of Dr. Ariane Janse van Rensburg. The focus of the AEFA is on architectural education that is relevant for Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. The conceptual idea of this series of 5 perspectives is to look at the challenges and opportunities for architectural and urban design thinking at 3 different scales, and then to explore how this might impact practice and education. Perspective 1 looked at the impact of COVID-19 at the scale of the city. Perspective 2 at the scale of a district or neighborhood, and today's perspective is more at the scale of a complex or a building. The next 2 weeks will look at the impact on practice and education. In framing each of the 5 perspectives, we have invited 3 panelists with different backgrounds and experiences to present their ideas in the hope of stimulating and provoking a broader conversation, not to find specific solutions, but rather to open up the thinking around how we might move forward progressively under the challenging circumstances that the pandemic has brought into focus. The advantage of having an online event is that we can include panelists and an audience from across the country. In doing this, we also realized what a wealth of knowledge and expertise we have in South Africa, and it was really difficult to hone in on whom to invite. We realized that we have not included many valuable opinions and inputs, but we have tried to include perspectives from different fields, experiences, and contexts. For our third perspective, how has COVID-19 impacted how we create responsive architecture? Our chair is Kevin Bingham. Kevin is a current International Union of Architects, or URA, council member representing Region 5, Africa, and facilitates the UIA's COVID-19 Information Hub. He is a director of the award-winning FGG Architects based in Durban. Kevin is a former president of the South African Institute of Architects and currently serves on the South African Council for the Architectural Profession, where he chairs the Education and RPL committees. He is the co-founder of SAIA's OpenArchitecture. And then before I hand over to Kevin, just some house rules. If you can keep your microphones off and your videos, if please. And also during the presentations, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will collate them or try and answer them after you've put them there. And then after the presentations, you will have time to ask more questions, and there will be a general discussion after that. So, Kevin, I hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Hermie, and good day to everyone that's viewing us today. Wonderful to be here. I'm in Durban. The other speakers are all over the country, so great to be with you all. I see the numbers are at 189 at the moment. It's obviously an honor for me to chair this session, and I thank you for inviting me. It's also an honor to be a part of a series that is looking for solutions rather than a rehashing of problems that we have all become too aware of. Those that have been following the series of these perspectives over the last 2 weeks will be aware that the focus of the first two sessions has been the city and also the urban development and design. Today we consider architecture and its landscape and address the matter of responsivity. We will also consider if the impact of the epidemic will force a change in the way in which architects have to engage with their profession, their environment, and their role in society. We are very fortunate to have three excellent contributors to the discussion today: Torsten Dekler, Ankia Bormans, and Luyanda Mpatwa. All three have valuable experience in working in a range of communities and on projects of varying complexities, and will be ideal guides for us in our questioning of how the health reality we are currently within may or may not impact on how we create responsive architecture. I'll be introducing each of the three speakers in turn. We're going to be starting with Torsten, and then Ankia, and then Luyanda. And each of them have given me a short bio. When I say short, some shorter than others, to introduce them. So I'll read each of those out to you. And as I say, first up, and each speaker is given between 10 and 15 minutes to speak. After the three speakers have completed, I'll be asking each of them a question. You're welcome to enter in the chat any questions that you may have that the hosts will be keeping a record of, and we'll ask those if time permits later. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Torsten Dekler. Torsten is an architect driven by a deep purpose to create spaces in which people can thrive. Over the past 15 years, he has realized a number of key buildings as well as exhibitions, films, and workshops that explore how this can be pursued. The work produced by 26 Degrees 10 South Architects, the practice he founded with Anne Gropner and now heads up on his own, is extremely localized to the South African context. Each project, be it a taxi rank with wood-burning cooking places, an extension to an housing complex using leftover bricks, or university course on in situ upgrading development solutions from inside of complex problems. To achieve this, the practice has employed exhibitions, publications, and films to tell stories, that emphasize context and the process as key design informants through drawing, and Torsten can draw, I promise you, and large-scale model workshops. Torsten has been working with people, and not just architecture students, to develop a vision for a popular urbanism that is neither utopian nor dystopian, but eminently achievable. Torsten, over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. So, just turning on the video. Here we go. I'm sharing my screen. Okay. So you might be slightly puzzled by this picture, and it's actually, I don't know if it was an earring or a piece of jewelry, but it's actually a turd, a golden turd. So I'm going to be talking about poo. The reason I want to talk about this is because I find it's really important for architects to realize and make connections to the important work they do beyond the kind of traditional parameters of the profession. Like, we like to talk about buildings and make buildings, but how do those buildings influence the bigger issues at stake? And I believe that COVID-19 has brought the bigger issues in stark relief, and put tremendous pressure on us. And I think the pressure is now more than ever to actually be seen to do something. And I'm very worried that what we are looking at is that money and technocratic, top-down, technology-driven solutions are being thrown at the problem. And so that's why I want to talk about human waste, and to just demonstrate a way that one can think and talk about it that isn't so that is far more holistic. And I think in this instance, architects have a kind of a superpower, and that is that when you do a building, you need to integrate a whole bunch of conflicting requirements, and you have to synthesize an experience that creates broad-based buy-in, for all the users of that building. On the other hand, we also can zoom into the scale of a door handle, and we can zoom back out to how this building sits in a context. But another thing is, when we talk about responsive architecture, and we consider what do architects respond to, we respond to the people who actually pay for our services. And if in the public realm, public works, I've come across discounts on projects that go up to 70 to 75%, architects are going to respond to that context. So they're going to try and still make the project work. And so to address deep structural issues, like for instance sanitation that I'm going to be talking about, something needs to shift so that we're not compromised and driven into a corner through kind of the fees we can earn on projects. And so throughout the 15 years I've been working, I've always tried to do things beyond architecture, like exhibitions, publications, and films, because I think it's very important that we talk about architecture and what we do in a very broadly accessible way, because architecture affects everybody 24 hours a day. We're an urbanized species, and we live in buildings, we exist in buildings, we live in buildings, we work in them, we train in them. So so I want to make kind of what architects can do quite global. So if we consider waste, so traditionally an architect will just try and get rid of the waste, right? Plumb it into the city sanitation system, and not think about it anymore. But I think it's actually an amazing opportunity to, if you consider that human waste has a kind of embodied value of up to $9.5 billion US. And if you read the news and you see that all this fracking is going on in the Karoo, there's pressure to do it, and you actually think about what we do is we flush waste with drinking water away, and then we try and recycle it back to drinking water. It doesn't make any sense. So I want to ask, can we imagine sanitation as a new marketplace for innovation, entrepreneurship, and investment, in which human waste and sewage is not something most people do not want to think about, but it's actually an opportunity for positive change and innovation? And I'll describe to you a little bit in these few slides how I arrived at this position. But in the sort of thinking about the theme, you know, as architects, we really very concerned about dignity. But if, you know, basic things don't work, so for instance, globally, there's 4.5 billion people that don't have safe ablutions. And if you look at the slide of a 3-day toilet festival where people actually want to manifest having proper sanitation, that's why they bring their, you know, future toilet that's going to go into their future home with them to this festival, it becomes a very powerful place for architects to work. And this is our experience of mapping 7.2 kilometers of raw sewage flowing through reception area of Diepsloot, which is a post-apartheid settlement, 75% informal households. And you think about living in the 30,000 households day to day with sewage running past your doorstep and all the implications of that, not to speak of, you know, the dignity issue. It's also directly linked to social stability. So in the 5 months of 2018 that this statistic refers to, there was a service delivery protest almost every single day in South Africa. And if my earlier point was that architecture essentially services those with the money to pay for it, so we end up servicing 1 or 2% of the population or being beholden to that sector, which is politicians or local municipal managers. We're taking our eye off the kind of broad mass that actually should benefit from good design, and which also, or let's say, I don't want to judge good or bad design, but considered design. And are we able to grow and develop and evolve solutions from our local problems? Because I strongly believe that the solutions lie inside the problems, and I don't think you can create blanket approaches to how to deal with problems like this. I came across a thing that Arab designed, like a mobile washstand, which would be great for corrupt politicians to order lots of them, get a kickback, and end up on landfill sites. So I'm just concerned with how do we do sustainable solutions. And if you think about the value of those sustainable solutions, it has a direct impact on other services. So for instance, healthcare. You know, overall, if you can engage with the sanitation issue we face, you will be saving money elsewhere. And this is one of the gripes I have about the lockdown and how it was considered in terms of sort of silo thinking that we don't have enough hospital beds. But there was no economist in the room when those decisions were made, and how that impacts on livelihood. So whilst you now gain time to provide further hospital beds, you know, we have really severely compromised people's livelihoods. And so I think a way for architects to talk about these issues is to just broach them as bigger conditions that are interrelated. And this is just an image of what could a potential solution look like. And this is just the tip of an iceberg of relationships that need to be created, conversations and insights. But it can be incredibly simple, but incredibly powerful in how it functions, and it can function across scale. So you can look at a place like Diepsloot, and you can simply retrofit the existing failing infrastructure, replace it with bigger units and even bigger ones, which can at the same time be cross-programmed to provide a whole bunch of other services. So if you think of sanitation not just as in the toilet where you flush and the poo goes away, but in terms of a nodal point that can resolve a number of issues, including healthcare, childminding, and business opportunities, it becomes very, very interesting. In terms of sustainability, I mean, this is a no-brainer. This is actually the 7.2 kilometer sewage flowing into the Yukska tributary, which then gets spread all around Gauteng, ends up in the Vaal Dam and Hartbeespoort Dam. But there are ways in which you can do this now, in which you can treat this waste in a relatively straightforward manner, which I would argue is simpler than simply using drinking water to flush it away. And And this is kind of a romantic image, and this has changed since COVID, is like traditional bathhouses that have been used all over the world to provide sanitation to people but they have always been like cultural and social institutions. And it doesn't mean that if COVID, like if we don't have a vaccine yet, or even if we do have one, that these can't be institutions that are valued. And why I'm saying this is that there's so many examples of state implemented ablution infrastructure which is simply failing because it doesn't have ownership and it doesn't have a value beyond that thing of flushing away waste. In this instance, the waste can be used to create area lighting, which is a big issue in underserved and informal settlements in any case. And this is not very far-fetched. I'll show you an example from Kenya. But if we think about cross-programming and hybridizing solutions to structural issues, we can end up also stimulating a local economy. You know, you can have, because these are points of confluences, they will inevitably have someone set up shop right outside the door. And why can't this be accommodated with foresight and at the same time local health services be provided? And this is the example I wanted to show you. This is run by an NGO called Umande Trust. This is a picture of Kibera outside, well, in Nairobi. It's one of the biggest informal settlements in the world. And the existing states provided ablution facilities have all but disintegrated. So people have resorted back to the helicopter toilet, which is that you put your waste in a bag and you spin it around and just get it as far away from you as possible. And in came this group of people who've designed facilities that treat the waste on site, generate methane from which actually restaurants are run, and there are also shops as part of the caretaking function in the base of this. So if what I was showing you might sound like a pie in the sky, it's not, because it's working in other areas in the world. And to conclude, what I think is quite important is that our conversations need to go beyond beyond our self-referential group. I was at the launch of the UN Pillar for Informality in Munich in 2013, I think, and there wasn't a single community member or member of these huge grassroots organizations that have actually taken in hand in situ upgrading. And what becomes exciting when those conversation gets connected beyond just the architectural fraternity is what happened in this picture, which is a workshop I was involved in running in East London, which was to just explain the idea of in situ upgrading to town planners, engineers, and architects. And in the center of the picture is the informal mayor of Paula Park, which is a small informal settlement within an RDP development. And he's complaining about the new roads that need to go through his settlement and how it's going to compromise his constituency, who will have smaller yard spaces, and they use the yard spaces for a whole number of reasons. Next to him is a town planner who is explaining that you need the roads to bring emergency vehicles into your settlement. And the two civil engineers sitting either side with the stripy shirts, and they were saying, look, you are in a stormwater runoff, and like the roads are really infrastructure to protect you against flooding and washing away. And up there, the blonde guy is an architect, and he was saying, well, actually, the roads will do all of this, plus they will provide you social space in addition to that. And so I think this illustrates very well how just by a shift in thinking, by crowding in multiple opinions into looking at really difficult, tricky, and wicked problems, you can enrich your view of those for everyone around the table. And that is one way in which we can start developing solutions. And I'm very concerned that COVID is just creating so much pressure that this is seen as an absolute luxury, you know, to have dialogue. But I think it's an absolute necessity. So if anything has proven in the months of COVID in South Africa and all the scandals around that, is that we need to be more thoughtful and less rushed in how we develop solutions. So that's my bit. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Torsten. Excellent presentation and perfectly on time as well. So obviously you prepared that and practiced it. Thank you very much. As you know, we'll ask a question at the end. So I'm going to move straight on to our second speaker. And thanks again, Torsten. Our second speaker for today is Ankia Bormans. Ankia has prepared a short bio for me to present to you as well. Ankia is the founder of Terra Plus Landscape Architects. So we're moving from one landscape type to another type. Terra Plus Landscape Architects was founded in 2012. Ankia has a Bachelor of Architecture Studies and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Cape Town. Ankia describes herself as an ordinary person, not defined by her profession, with an insatiable curiosity. She enjoys immersion in beauty, be it place, object, or music. And she adds, indeed, all elements which affect our senses. Ankia, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to thank Hermie for inviting me to this. It's been interesting to listen to everyone and to listen to the past talks. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Obviously, let me just do that. So, as a landscape architect, I think COVID has brought to light interesting ideas around public space and our responsive design of public space. And Torsten mentioned that we live in buildings and we thrive in buildings and we enjoy living in buildings and we function in buildings, but we actually also do function in the spaces between buildings, as Jan Gill always talks about. So for me, it was quite important to understand how these spaces if you talk about COVID and sort of post-COVID world, what that actually means, and are they going to change, and will they change? And I've got questions around that. So this first picture is just a picture that I took of 2 years ago, and the way we deal with spaces between the buildings and streets that are public spaces, and it really illustrated to me how we have our own way of managing public space. We don't need to be told to stand 1.5 meters away. We actually do have rules of engagement that are existing in society. And I don't think that our public spaces will necessarily change because of COVID. I think the rules of engagement might, and how we deal with that public space and how people talk and walk and live in those spaces when they exit buildings, and the interfaces of those buildings with the public space would I think, perhaps change. These are questions that I think are, for me, too difficult to answer yet. I don't know the answers to them. I just think that there are certain ways that we can perhaps look at them. I think what happened in the past and what has come to light is the importance of these spaces, because we all need to connect as human beings, and perhaps the need to have them as integrated design spaces rather than residual spaces between the buildings. So as humans, this is another example of how we really have a need to connect. And I do think that we will go back to this. I don't think we will sit in a situation where we will be separated from each other for any length of time. I think we will actually just gravitate back to how humans normally function. But what I do think has happened in COVID is that we have had an exceptional amount of stress placed on us as people. And we've all revved it at 6,000 revs, maybe people, some even gone into the red, into 7,000 and 8,000 revs. I know, certainly I did. The stresses that were for me significant were the fact that I couldn't connect to people. For my sister, who's an introvert, it didn't matter. She was behind a computer, she was happy. I did not enjoy it. So for me, there was a significant amount of stress that was subliminally created. And I think what everybody realized was that nature really is our way of getting away from that stress, of getting our heads to zero and just getting back into the green waves of our lives. And how we do that in public space, because inevitably you have some greenery or some landscape in public space, and sometimes you don't, which is fine, but you're still outside. And you're connected to the earth and you're connected to the sky. So I think how we do that has become a real sort of design issue, and how we create those interfaces between the buildings. So actually it's almost a challenge to architects to start realizing that it's not, the design does not stop, the realm does not stop at the end of the building, and how buildings are placed in the landscape rather than on the landscape is what is significant. So, and then how we make those spaces between those buildings for people to really function well. And what it is that people need from nature. Is it that they need to connect, or is it, do they need to isolate, or do they need to feel as if they can find themselves or find other people within those spaces? And then I was fortunate enough to be part of a project where the introductory discussion that I had with a client, and it's quite a small project, it's not a very big project, but it's quite a significant project, was that the introductory discussion that I had with the client was that she started the conversation by saying space is political. And I don't actually know how to respond to that, because what does that mean for a designer? You know, what does that mean for me as a designer when your client says, look, space is political? How do you respond to that? Does it mean that you have to stand on a soapbox and become an activist? I don't know. A lot of questions came up in the office, and how we discussed it, and how do you design if your client says space is political? And we started challenging that in the office, and discussions that we had in the office. And we're in an office where we sit around and have long discussions, maybe to the detriment of the workflow and our productivity. But be that as it may, it's exciting. And the first notion that actually came about, and this has to do with responsiveness, is that right to move and access space. Doesn't matter what background or set of values that you come with. And unfortunately, as designers, we come with a set of values, whether we like it or not. We would like to think that we don't, but we do. And that the space should allow for a multitude and varied ways of interacting with it, and interpretation of experiences. Wait 1 second. That for us as open space designers, not building designers, the destinations must be legible and allow for the orientation in the space, but that ultimately that space should be non-deterministic. And the definition for me of that is really that, yes, you may determine where the path is, but you must allow for the adaptive change of that path to happen through time as people use it. I think a lot of our public spaces are actually quite determined on and rigorous on how people should engage with those public spaces. And I think that has to change. We have to shift the way we think about that, because we apply values that are not necessarily applicable now, post-COVID or during COVID, and certainly not in long term, that the spaces become stagnant and not rich enough and complex enough for people to engage in. But this does not preclude that destinations should have the same quality. So you can have within a space, you can have different destinations, and they can be a coffee shop, or they can be, as Torsten has shown, they can be a functional system, or they can be an ecological system. So they don't have to have the same qualities, but I think that how you get to them and their legibility in the space should be quite clear. And that within this space, there should be these kernels of things that happen within the space. So you'd have a place where you could isolate yourself completely if you need to, because you've had so much trauma in your life that you actually need to be able to go into a public space because you can't function in your small flat that you're living in, but that you do need a certain degree of isolation within that space so that you can assimilate what's happening in your life, or you can collect with a couple of friends, or you can have a gathering of people, and how you do that, and the distances that you then have to follow because somebody tells you to, which I think is problematic, then has to also be able to be accommodated in this space. And that's actually, for me, at this point, how I'm thinking of design in public space and design of spaces between buildings. I don't know how I'm doing for time here, but I'm happy to carry on with the discussion, because there are ideas of the idea that space is also a place that is conditional, that we are sitting in a situation where the most of our public spaces are conditioned that we either spend money or there has to be some sort of function that happens there. And I think public space should become more unconditional. I think we should have a situation where there can just be an exchange of connectedness, or exchange of ideas, or exchange. And I suppose Zoom is one of those spaces, if we want to think about it as a public space. It is a public space where we're sitting and we're discussing things, and we're discussing ideas, and we're generating ideas. So that is, in short, where I'm at the moment with my thinking, and where I would put my two cents worth into the discussion. So that's it.
Thanks very much, Ankia. That's great. Well done. We are a bit short. We have extra time, but we'll come back to it. So we'll come back and talk about, conditional space at the end. So let's come back to that again. Thank you very much. I'll move now on to the third speaker and final speaker of the day. Is Dr. Luyanda Mphathwa, is the South African Institute of Architects immediate past president, and is an adjunct professor at UCT's African Center for Cities. He is a Cape Town-based architect and urban designer, and a commentator on various design and socially relevant matters regarding the urban condition of African cities. His architecture education in South Africa was interrupted when he was incarcerated on Robben Island prison in 1981. He's not that old, 1981. And I remember that day very well because I was with him at the time. And that's he was incarcerated for his role in the anti-apartheid struggle. After his release in 1986, he left for Germany, where he spent 15 years in exile. He obtained his MSc in architecture at the Technical University in Berlin, Germany. Before founding Luyanda Mphathwa Design Space Africa in 2009, he was a partner at MMA Architects for 12 years. Luyanda was awarded an honorary doctorate in science and technology from the Walter Sisulu University in 2010 for his contribution to innovative design and technology, and has received various design awards, including the Sire Korobrik Award of Excellence in 2006 for the South African Embassy building in Berlin. He was also the recipient of the USA-based Curry Stone Design Prize in 2008 for the design in Darba Sandbag low-cost house in Mitchell's Plain in Cape Town. He is currently serving on various boards and councils, including the South African Heritage Resources Agency and the South African Institute of Architects. He is a member of the Urban Design Institute of South Africa and of the Construction Industry Rapid Response Task Team, established with the announcement of the lockdown due to COVID-19, and which has been really instrumental in getting architecture back into the office again. Luyanda Mphathwa, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. And I have to also thank STADIO OpenArchitecture for inviting me to this very interesting topic, which I would like to also throw my 2 cents worth. In fact, Torsten and Ankia have introduced themes which I think are very relevant as we face the COVID situation. And I would like to share my own thoughts. The opening statement by Hemi that, you know, we need to think about how architecture can respond post-COVID and how we can bring design thinking into the scheme of things. For me, is the key. And I think we need to apply our minds, actually, whether we are going to allow the situation we find ourselves to be a stop and think moment, whereby we reflect on what we have been doing as a profession in terms of addressing challenges in our urban environment, or are we just going to continue as we've been doing? And I'd like to highlight some of the issues which I think might be looking back a bit, but with the hope that out of those questions which I'd like to pose, we might find some answers. Kevin did mention that I was part of the task team that was set up when COVID kind of shook the world. And in South Africa, the lockdown was introduced. I'd like to start with that because one of the things which made me interested in being part of that initiative was actually understanding that our built environment and the construction sector in general, which we're part of as architects and urban design people and all the design disciplines, is actually very fragmented. We actually have allowed ourselves, particularly as architects, to be in the periphery of the action. I think, have seen over the last few years that our role in society as thinkers, as strategic thought leaders, become eroded and kind of being pushed into the periphery. We're only just seen as service providers, but not people who can think and who can contribute towards a better urban environment. And I saw the opportunity of being part of the task team as an opportunity to actually re-establish ourselves as part of the broader community of built environment practitioners and stakeholders and therefore play our meaningful role. So that for me has been quite an eye-opener in terms of how even issues that affect architects have actually been in the periphery. We've been trying to engage with government as part of the task team to kind of, provide ideas. And yet we've continued to see how decisions about urban development are actually made in front of us and we don't have a role to play. And then the other thing which I think I need to mention in this context is that there were some projects that were started which were supposed to deal with the issue which was called de-densification, which meant that, as we are aware, some of the problems of overcrowding and that made the highest impact of COVID to be in the township areas, in the informal settlements, is because no social distancing is possible there. So the government started some projects that were meant to kind of be emergency housing relief projects to kind of relieve the situation. But I can tell you now, not a single of those projects has actually come off the ground just because of the complexity and the bureaucracy that we face as a country in terms of just how to get projects on stream. So basically, we had emergency funding, we had emergency projects and programs, but we've not been able to implement them because our environment and our project rollout strategies actually do not enable us to be able to act so quickly. And this is one of the challenges we have. So COVID for me came to a country like South Africa, which already had problems prior to COVID, where people were living in unhealthy conditions, where people were living in overcrowded conditions, where we've allowed urban sprawl to continue further and further from the main places of work. And those conditions, as Torsten was saying, basic sanitation, that's not being provided. So I think that if we miss the opportunity that COVID and all its ramifications has created, and we do not do that check, where are we, where have we been, and where could we go? We'll have lost a very big opportunity. Now, coming back to the things I'd like to talk about, I happen to work a lot in the township areas, and I'd just like to share just a few slides, if I'm allowed. I didn't prepare you for this, Kevin, but I thought it's worthwhile doing. Let me see if I'm going to be allowed. It looks like I am. These are just a few slides that actually illustrate the kind of work that I'm involved in. And when I say COVID came at a time when, we've got particular environment and conditions in South Africa that just made it impossible for the people who live in these environments to respond adequately to the challenges of COVID and to social distancing, because these are the environments where the majority of people, at least in the urban centers, live. And I'm currently involved in a project of informal settlement upgrading in KOSOVO and Philippi Township. The situation there is not different to this. This is a project of human settlements. And one of the things that I've learned and I'm really trying to promote is the fact that the way architecture will respond to this post-COVID situation is through architecture activism. And I'm taking this from, in fact, I prepared for this kind of approach. And I find Torsten using the same language, which I found quite interesting, because I think if we do not develop that activism approach, we are not going to be able to even understand the people that we're building for. So as part of the project that I'm involved in KOSOVO, informal settlement, one of the things that I took upon myself to do is to actually engage in participatory design processes. Because I think that if we do not engage with the public, if we do not ensure that we derive knowledge from the way the people live in those areas so that we can perhaps use our skills to take that knowledge forward and translate it into design products. This is the way I believe we can be responding adequately to the challenges we're finding. Because when I went into KOSOVO, I actually found that the community there is so organized and they've got well-established networks that would be unfortunate to destroy and say you're coming with a new urban form and new urban environments. Yes, we need to create livable environments for those kinds of situations, but we need to understand also how the people have been living so that we don't destroy everything. The term throw the baby with the bathwater kind of thing. So for me, the issue that we should inform ourselves, we should consult with the people we're building for, and we should involve them in the process. And we should collaborate with other professionals in terms of trying to find solutions, engage landscape consultants, engage services engineers engage local practitioners who are actually development facilitators to make sure that we actually can engage with the people in a meaningful way. And in that process, we need to empower them to understand the environments that they are going to inherit, but we're also empowering ourselves to actually develop better environments. This is my take, and this is my lessons that I've learned through the process of working. It's 3 years now we're working on Kosovo, and we've only started construction this year. Now, one of the interesting things an architect is that you have tools and mediums that you use. So we've used the things that we've been trained to use, build models at different scales, share them with the communities, make sure your people understand what you're trying to do. And that for me is perhaps more relevant now because COVID makes us to have to find new ways of doing things. But these are things which were evident and clear for all of us even before COVID. I couldn't see how as architects we could continue focusing on doing design work in areas where it's comfortable to do so, and not actually engage adequately in those areas which we would say are marginalized in our societies. I'm going to come back to that. I'm not doing a presentation here, but I'm actually showing a process whereby I think the architect has to go back to the things that are basically simple and say, how does architecture serve society? How does architecture encourage new forms of collaboration with the people that we are building for and we are trying to engage in the design processes. And it's also not enough for us to design these spaces sitting in our boardrooms, or it is also not enough to say these people live in Philippi and therefore that's where they need to remain. I brought them to my office, did design workshops with them, share with them the kind of different typologies which I think we should be looking at, try and encourage communities to also consider higher densities, because the fact that we're promoting urban sprawl to me is actually denying the fact that our land is actually under pressure and we cannot accommodate all the people. And if we do not look at densification models, there is no way we are going to actually deal with the challenges that we have. And if you see the models that have got orange parts, those for me are actually incremental opportunities that we need to build into the design processes and not be shocked when people put backyard shacks and everything. We need to design for these things. We need to make sure that when we create these environments, how do we enable new forms of space making that ensure that people can know that they can extend their housing and have incremental opportunities. And when you share it with them during the design stage, it actually makes them aware of what they can do when they have, the housing opportunities that they'll be granted. So Kosovo is a settlement like this. It's got 15,000 people living there. It's within the red line. There are 6,000 dwellings at the moment. There's one tap for every 65 people. There's one toilet for every 80 people. Boston, there is no sanitation that has been provided there. And how do you then go about, whilst you're planning, which is going to take 5 years, how do you deal with issues of sanitation today? How do you deal with issues of hygiene? And these are the realities that have been there before COVID and are going to remain even post-COVID. But as architects, urban designers, landscape architects, and everyone, we need to find solutions that are going to try and provide, solutions to this. I won't go into the design processes involved because that's not the objective of this talk. But it's just to sensitize us to the fact that we need to engage in these areas so that we can create those environments which Ankia has been talking about. I share the view that space is political, definitely, because without understanding that, we will not be able to understand that spatial justice is the new terrain of struggle from my point of view. It's a new area which we need to engage with to make sure that when we create spaces, we understand that it is linked to the justice that people deserve wherever they live in whatever environments they live in. And this is what we need to help create. And I think we do need to spend money in public space so that we can be able to engage, provide spaces, and allow children to unfold. And these are all things in the design processes that we've embarked upon in these projects. We've tried to kind of integrate. Now, I think COVID happened in a situation where a settlement like Kosovo, which is currently here, sorry this moved a bit, is part of a larger Cape Flats environment where we've got a myriad of problems. We've got big challenges that we need to engage on in order to ensure that we can create better environments there. And I think if we do not use this moment to really rethink our approaches, we'll be missing an opportunity. So to close my contribution, I've posed certain questions which I sent to Kevin, and I said, why has, okay, let me not make it a general statement, but let me say my contention is that our education system has not paid much focus to these kinds of environments and this kind of practice of architecture, because it is seen as not being part of the broader theory of architecture. And I think this is something we need to change. That's my opinion. I do not think that there's been adequate funding allocated to ensure that, one, we arrest urban sprawl, and two, to ensure that our cities have got integrated projects that are actually started to start thinking about how do we make our cities more inclusive, more compact, and arrest the urban sprawl. I don't think we have any city in South Africa where there's been a deliberate urban integration project. You can look at Sandton, you can look at Century City in Cape Town, you can look at Mhlanga in Durban. All those are large infrastructure, urban development projects, but they not solve this problem that we're talking about around the informal settlements in Philippe and wherever else. So I think that also the professional bodies that we are part of, I'm part of SIA, I'm a registered professional with SECAT. I don't think we have played an adequate role, and I think we've lost our relevance somehow. And I would hope that this is a moment where we can stop and think and reflect and say, okay, how do we regroup? How do we take the processes forward? Kevin, we can deal with the solutions I have in mind as part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luyanda. Excellent talk, and thank you to the other two speakers as well. We've got about half an hour left for our viewing and webinar. And what I'd agreed with the three speakers that I'd ask a question, there's been a link between the three speakers and what they've all been talking about. And what I planned to ask Torsten actually links into what Luyanda's been speaking about. And it was really to do with how we talk about the big issues differently. Luyanda has raised some issues about community participation. And Torsten, I wonder if you want to expand on that or would like to, please.
Yeah, so I have like 5 points which can guide us in how we talk about what we do. And I think one is to realize who we design for. So if we design for people in Diepsloot, we're not just designing for people in Diepsloot, we're designing for our whole society. because and that's what COVID has taught us, is that the health of everybody or of like people in deficit really impacts back into the entire society. So that's the kind of discourse I think that doesn't exist at the moment, sort of making connections. And I totally agree with the person who said to Annika that the space and design is political. I think every single thing you do, even if you disengage from politics, is in the end political. And then I think education is a really important thing. And there I would quote like a famous marketeer who says, "He who educates the market owns the market." But you need to, and that's where we have to dig quite deep, you know, and I think we tend to, as architects, beat ourselves up a bit, which I think holds us back. Oh, let me start, put the video on, sorry, there we go. It holds us back a bit because we forget about the incredible skill we have in synthesizing whole environments. And I think that can be applied to how we think about cities and neighborhoods and health of our cities. So, and that we need to educate ourselves as a profession and all the people we come in touch with. I recently met a guy from London who is he curates experiences and he's an architect. So what he does is he engages with brands, and one of his clients is Melbourne Airport, and he looks at, from the moment somebody touches or engages with Melbourne Airport, be they an employee or a traveler or a cleaner, that whatever message that Melbourne stands for as a city is communicated clearly. So I think we have a lot to learn from how to communicate. The third thing that everybody was saying, that, or Leander especially, to collaborate and to bring in the skills that we need, the insights. And I think what I found is if you communicate your values very clearly, you can create a really clear understanding around a meeting table, be it in your office or on site somewhere. Like, what do we believe in? And to be quite clear about that. And then observation, Leander also said, like, if you look at what people already do to survive and thrive in a context, is like I mean, everything's there already. You know, they have, in the way people live, they have already solved a problem, an economic problem. So it's really important to look at how that is solved. And then to think beyond our professional boundaries. And that probably links more into collaboration, but to use a different language also, something that speaks to the bigger pain points and aspirations of society, because we can get caught up a lot in, you know, our jargon. So if we talk about nodes, I mean, what is a node? And you talk to someone, node or activity corridor, you know, those things are just foreign to people. And if we show people drawings, it's like an engineer showing you a structural formula. It means nothing. And we think our drawings are very nice, but we've got to talk with different pictures, I think. And so one of the interesting projects I'm about to begin with, and it has a lot to do with communication, is I'm developing an idea for a TV series on architecture, but I'm not going to use the word architecture at any stage in this whole project. I just want to talk about the spaces we live in, because I think that's at the moment where I see the need, is to demystify this and take it out of its ghetto.
Thanks, Dawson. Thanks for the response. We'll come back to that. I'm sure the other speakers would like to add more to that later. I'll just run through my 3 questions first, if I may. And my question to Ankia is, you have written about non-deterministic design and design in flux, and you have questioned if it can be learned. Would you possibly expand on these thoughts related to the topic that we're dealing with today, being responsive architecture?
Yeah, that's now I've got to think about what I think about that. It is interesting to understand that our society and our spaces that we inhabit is complex. So if you understand the complexity and you understand shifting and changing of spaces, and that spaces should be able to change, and how does one design within that shifting scenario. And I think that's what Leander also touched on or not touched on or spoke about, was these environments where people have actually solved many of the problems, and they have done it through great change and through great difficulty and through those great challenges. And they're complex societies and they're complex communities, and they have solved problems that perhaps the way one learns about solving those problems is to actually observe more than trying to intervene necessarily. And I think therein lies the value of learning how to design in places that are complex and undergo huge changes, that are in flux. So I think but that does bring me back to non-deterministic design. Is how do you allow for something to happen, and how do you allow for something to adapt through time, especially when you have a space that's engaged by various different parts of the community and people of the community, because it has to respond to that. I don't know if I've answered the question really, but there we go.
Thanks very much. My question for Luanda is, Luanda, in your role at UCT and the African Center for Cities, how do you see fit to guide your students in research in this area specific to Africa? Will you mute yourself?
That's please? Not me. Okay. Can I go? Okay. Okay, Kev, the question you've posed to me about my role at the African Center for Cities, well, firstly, it's aspirational at the moment. It's a very new role. I mean, I've just been appointed now in June, and appointed at a time where everything is online. So, and adjunct profs are not like full-time profs that actually, start their own programs, but we are still working out how and what role am I going to play. But I can tell you that my aspirations have a lot to do with how I can contribute to bring some of these aspects that I've highlighted into the education system. I'm really of the view that the kind of guidance which I think our educational institutions should be giving is not, and I know some people disagree with me, but I'll say it anyway. I do not think our universities are engaging enough at the level where we explore issues that relate to the communities that I've just been talking about. And a lot of the students that I come across and who come out of university or who come to work in my office get confronted with these issues in practice. And I find this very unfortunate because I think it is at universities where that sensibility should actually be promoted, encouraged. And if I have an opportunity to introduce that kind of teaching, if you like, I don't even know if I'll be teaching at all. This is what I would like to see happen. I think we need a new generation of professionals across the design disciplines, across the built environment disciplines. Firstly, introduce issues of cross disciplinary teaching, because I do think that there's a lot of kind of silo-based teaching. Engineers only see themselves as engineers, architects are the doyens of design. No one can tell them about design. We don't even engage with other disciplines of a more sociological nature so that we can understand the cultures, the way of life of people, and how this influences the way we design. When I studied architecture in Berlin, there was a module which was called architectural sociology, for example, that taught us to understand how people's lifestyles, cultures influences the way we design. I'm not aware of any module like that in the teaching of architecture in our universities. Obviously, I don't know all of them, but I've not heard of it. And I think that we need to broaden the scope of architecture from this concentration and fixation with design and actually bring in other elements that are going to make us that profession that actually brings everything together as we claim to be. At the moment, we have focuses or we're focused on very particular aspects of design and putting buildings together. But in terms of urban contextual issues and other broader cross-disciplinary issues, I do not think that the teaching is strong enough. I mean, I do get invited to be external examiner in universities at master's level, or maybe to give an odd lecture. And it's always fascinating to see that students are actually not confronted with these issues that I talked about. So this is what I'd like to see happen. And I'd like to promote particularly the contextual relevance of education with our environments, and not just see architecture as a theoretical thing, which is about exercises at universities, but it does not actually have relevance to what we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So I know that there's a very big kind of, I don't know whether to call it a conflict, or maybe let's use a better word, tension between the academic work and practice. And I'd like to see those coming more closer together. That's what I'm aspiring to contribute as I enter into this role.
Thanks very much, Luyanda. There's the 5th week of this, in other words, in 2 weeks' time, the focus is on education and what we should be teaching. So I'm hoping we'll all join that one and contribute. It's now 12 minutes past 5, which leaves us just over 15 minutes. I'm unaware if there are any questions that have come up in the chat box, and I'll speak to Hermie about that. Well, she can answer me in a moment, but I just wanted to kind of go back to some words that have been mentioned already and across the 3 speakers really. And in Torsten's presentation, he spoke about a holistic approach. And when we got through to Ankia, that was really the connectivity, I think that struck home for me, and that in that area of the linkages between things. And we spoke, I think, even in last week's presentation, there was a large part of it based on connections that are formed, both visual and interpersonal connections. That ties with that. But I wanted to just ask a question of all 3 of the speakers, if I may, just to, before we go on to you, Hermie. It has to do with people and their perceptions of us as architects, and for that matter, landscape architects. And I think Luyanda mentioned the word, they see us as thinkers. And is that perhaps where we've lost the ground, in that everyone can think, or the TV shows that we currently have show that, people think that that's what we do. And it'd be interesting, and it is interesting to hear that he said that not much ground has been made in the progress with the government. And really that's where we need to push even harder. And that word activism, I think, is something that we need to jump in. Would any of the speakers like to comment on that?
Yeah, I can say something about the activism. So for a few years, we were involved with informal settlement upgrading by basically teaching a course. And I think simply acting in support of communities that are on a trajectory to develop their spaces has been really a game changer for me, in the sense that we worked with people who were motivated to change their circumstance. And how that came about was because we put out a call saying we want to develop a course on in-situ upgrading, but we want to not do it at university, but rather within an existing settlement that can use whatever we can offer in terms of drawing. And I simply just kept it very simple, I said we can draw. And that was really incredible, because people were like as pushy and motivated and in my face as like the most hardcore developer. They were like, where are your drawings? When are you going to have them done? What are these guys doing? Can we make you lunch? And it was actually incredible. And when they hit a roadblock, they actually then took towards activism. If things didn't work out or they didn't get the support from the state as anticipated, they would then resort to, actively campaigning around those issues. And so the form of activism we practiced then was like a very mild one, actually. It was more within our own community and talking to the university, talking to other practitioners, and people we came in touch with about, hey, did you know that your tax money is paying for a house that people can essentially build themselves? So this is being used to buy votes, right? And then the whole thing is put on very cheap land outside cities. So did you know that that's what the government is doing, or what the RDP program is doing, although it had a genesis in a need that had to make up for lost time and lost numbers. The actual, it's about creating awareness around these issues and connecting the dots, I think, what's really important. For me, the activism has always been about, connecting the dots and speaking to people about what I do and why we do it and the things we learn along the way.
Thanks, Torsten. I don't know if anyone else wants to respond, but I just remembered to say that in education, there are actually 2 universities that are dealing with issues like this. I happen to be invited as an external examiner at the University of Pretoria, and there's a whole unit doing work in informal settlements, really valuable work. And so that currently exists, and also the University of Johannesburg have their units-based studies as well. So it's worth looking at, and again, I don't want to talk too much about that because it'll come up in 2 weeks' time. Hermie, anything from you in the question and answer side?
Hi,
sorry, Luanda wanted to say something. I see his hand.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you. Lou?
Yeah, Kevin, I thought maybe I should just add a few other aspects, because I've also been looking at the chats, what people are saying and everything. I do think that in all this, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom, obviously. We have to always better ourselves and find better ways of dealing with the issues. And I know for a fact that, I mean, Torsten and the work that he's done, I mean, over a long period of time has been dealing with these complex environments in our urban centers, that threshold between the formal and the informal. He's always been working in that. And I think what is just lacking is that we've not been able to translate those into larger scale programmatic approaches, especially when it comes to how we engage with government, because government is, let me not be misunderstood, has the obligation to provide the kind of support which they are giving through the housing delivery programs and all that for the most marginalized. Every government has got that responsibility. But I think that responsibility stops for me where that approach is only looking at those programs only from a quantitative basis, throw numbers, throw money at it, but not looking at actually how the qualities of those environments can be addressed. I mean, we were appointed for Philippi as a group of a variety of different teams for the Southern Corridor project. And in fact, it was the first time that architects were actually appointed to be involved at that level. And I mean, there were not even proper systems in place, even to negotiate our fees because there was no fee structure at that level. So it's a very, very big problem whereby I think our professional bodies have got a very big responsibilities to find that loophole and that space with which we can engage with government on a more at a more strategic level in terms of how can we assist to package these projects, not because we're just looking for work, but at that strategic level as thought leaders in the built environment. We are not there at that space, and we need to find ways to occupy, to get in there. Our professional bodies, I think, have to find some ways to deal with that, because we can't look at providing solutions on a quantitative basis only. We've got to look at the quality as well. And the next point, someone was asking, why are we providing our services only for the rich, basically, and for the very poor? What about the middle classes? The point I've been making throughout my practice in the last few years, and in my engagements and comments that I make, is that in South Africa, there is no incentive for property developers, for example, to provide affordable housing, because the legislation is just not geared towards that. The issue of dealing with land availability is one other big stumbling block. So essentially, the middle classes, even young professionals whom we employ, are actually unmarketable in the South African environment. And case studies I have done, cities of Munich, Washington, DC, have actually introduced incentives for developers to provide affordable housing on agreed terms with the cities. In Munich, they've got something called the Munich model that has actually established a separate planning directorate that looks at creating affordable housing for young professionals, people who've got work, and actually make sure that there is a category and criteria that you need to fulfill in order to get those housing. It's subsidized by the state. So the subsidy system is not only catering for the very poor, but it caters for also those who've got work. We don't have an environment like that in South Africa that I know of. Washington introduced inclusionary zoning to make sure that within the inner city of Washington, there are incentives whereby property developers are able to actually, provide affordable housing. Washington was a city like Cape Town where there was a very strong discrepancy between the rich and the poor, the black and the white. And a mayor of the day decided that this is going to be his priority. So we need thinking like that. And solutions are there from all over the world. But we've not been able to get those into the mainstream of thinking in South Africa so that we can actually make sure that we can provide solutions across the board for all the people. And this is where the challenge is. Social housing is a not known entity in South Africa, except as based on the SHRA legislation. But the context of affordable housing is not known as I understand it. So those are some of the issues I think we should be looking at into the future.
Thanks, Lou. Hermie, sorry, I cut you off just now. Anything you want to add?
Absolutely, no problem. No, there's very interesting discussions going on in the chat, and many of them are comments and people are answering each other. So I'm just going to highlight a few from right in the beginning. The first one is to Ankia, and then a more general one after that. Ankia, it's from Gareth Williams, and he asks, how do you deal with security in your design? And do you believe that society can become more involved? And he calls it house proud. And would we make the space more secure by always using the space as designed? Our lives are still too busy, and we don't always make time to dwell between spaces as we move through them. So he's actually asking about those spaces in between and security and how you deal with that. Yeah, so if you want to answer that one.
Hermie, those are quite hefty questions. They are always questions that come up when we are engaging with clients and with communities and about security and making those spaces safe for people. Essentially, I think a well-used space is a space that is safe. So if there is an intense use of that space and a well-used space, then inherently it becomes a safer space. It might not be the safest space, but it inherently becomes a safer space. And how you do that is to ensure that those interfaces between the buildings and the space are, I think, well thought through. So we should avoid having these public spaces as residual spaces between the buildings, which is often what happens. So the buildings are placed, I keep on saying this, they're placed on the landscape, not in the landscape. So they become spaces that are not well thought through, or the connection between the buildings are not well thought through. And that realm is really where that in-between space and how we design that is really where I think the crucial, I don't know how what word to use, but it's a crucial mechanism that we need to employ to ensure that those spaces are well designed. And it comes back to not having a multidisciplinary approach to a project, of getting architects in first and then saying, oh, by the way, we need to green up the space. Okay, let's quickly call the landscape architect. And we often find ourselves in that situation where we have to retrofit a space with healthy components because they think that it's necessary to have a green space. And it becomes problematic because you start questioning where positions of the buildings are and how the buildings have been placed in that space, and that they're not responsive, and it comes back to responsive space. So I think having a multidisciplinary team right from the beginning is essential to that conversation.
Thank you. I think this idea of collaboration and multidisciplinary teams have come up in all the presentations now, and it stands out as quite important in this discussion. And I want to mention two other comments, one by Fiona and one by Fadli Isaacs, which kind of talk together. And Fiona posed a question to Thorsten, but I'm just going to make it a general comment because we don't have so much time left. Thorsten, she asked, training for architects as program facilitators, and whether the architect as a principal agent has lost their space and should claim it back to become to be vehicles for change through public participation, and linking to both Thorsten and Luyanda's talks. And then Fadli said something interesting here, that recent experiences of COVID-19 health and food support raised the importance of partnerships as opposed to practices of public participation. I mean, it goes on to say it's a complex terrain, but I really find that interesting, that it's almost taking the concept of participation further so that it becomes a long-term solution. I'm going to ask one last word from Kevin and the three presenters, but very, very short, and then I'm going to say thank you.
I'm not going to say any other words other than a big thank you to the three speakers and to all those that have tuned in. And I know that Hermie, you will thank your team, your side, and Lone as well. So just thank you to everyone, and over to the others. Thank you.
Ankia, Luyanda, Thorsten, any of you that just want to say one last word?
Yeah, I can go. I think, yeah, thanks for doing this. And I think it's exciting that there's a new school on the horizon. I think it's necessary. And as always, I'm a big fan of having dialogue. But what I do miss is that this dialogue is accessible beyond our, as colleagues, that there are ways in which a school can communicate beyond that. And there's a quick anecdote. I met a guy from the Netherlands who set up an interdisciplinary course, and he was shut down by all the other science department because they lost all their students to that interdisciplinary course. So it's very interesting. Let's leave with that.
Thank you. Luyanda, one word.
Perhaps I can just add that it was really interesting to be part of the panel and hear the thoughts of both Thorsten and Luyanda. I appreciate that. And yes, I think there's lots of dialogue that has been started, and I think we shouldn't stop here. It's important to continue with this dialogue.
Yeah, thank you, Ankia. And yes, I also appreciate having been part of a panel like this and sharing the ideas, which I think at the end of the day, we do understand issues the same way, but maybe from very different angles. I think the dialogue should continue, but my cutting short is that, you know, it is one thing to say, you know, there are opportunities even from universities to engage with these issues. The link we're missing is that all these ideas have not found their way into execution and policy formulation by our government. I'm not aware of any of the programs of housing delivery that actually emanate from an academic and research program, whereby we are able to convince government that, yes, you know, we are responsible for education, but we also research issues that are of relevance to the policies that you're trying to drive. And this is where, for me, the big kind of gap is. And I saw a note that, you know, some universities are engaging like this. Great, but how do we get that to be actually noticed? And how do we actually influence policy and things that government is actually doing? I mean, there's an interesting document which I always refer to, Integrated Urban Development Framework. It was developed by COCTA, Cooperative Governments, and it was done in collaboration with the African Center for Cities. It's a great document about how urban development should happen, but no other department takes it into account. Human Settlements doesn't, Public Works doesn't. It's a great document which should be all kind of giving us guidance in terms of what the country is looking at into the next 30 years. But it's not being taken seriously. So there's a big gap from my point of view on how, you know, we formulate policies and how these are informed by other research or information that we actually bring into the picture. And that's why I think having lost the space that we have is going to take some doing in order to get back and be taken seriously. And I think there we've got a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I thank all the people that needs to get thanked, I want to remind you of our next perspective next week. And that is how has COVID-19 impacted how we practice architecture. Our chair for that will be Karen Smuts of CS Studio, and our participants are Kirsty Ron of CoLab Concepts Architects, Mark Thomas of Mark Thomas Architects, and Derek Henstra, founding partner and chairman of DHK Architects and Urban Designers. I would really thank Lone Paulson of OpenArchitecture for helping to conceptualize this perspective series, and a sincere thanks to Kevin for chairing a great session and pulling it all together. Thorsten for making a subject that we really not speak about often, very dignified and design worthy. I still wanted to ask you about composting toilets, but they will leave that for another time. And also for reminding about us that collaboration and multiple opinions and co-design across disciplines are very important. Ankia for reminding us how COVID has affected each of us and making us also think about the rules of engagement in public spaces. Luyanda for repositioning architects and urban designers as thought leaders in society and asking us to take up that position again, and also for confirming what Thorsten said about collaboration and public participation. They were all very engaging and entertaining, and introduced amazing ideas that we can take forward. I want to also thank everybody behind the scenes, Simon, who's our Zoom wizard, and Chelsea, who will organize all your certificates and send it to you, and Yolanda for representing the AFA, and for Brent from the Cape Institute for Architecture for making sure that you get your CPD. So I hope that you will join us next time. Oh, Chelsea is just reminding me that I must tell you that on the Architectural Education Forum website, there is and that is my dog, and that is very terrible at this point, but that there is a link on the AFA website to see the videos and take part in further conversations. Until next time, thank you.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. And hope to meet again.